Good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast, and good morning to those following on the West in the Central Time Zone. Those who are in Europe and Israel, we want to wish you a good evening. Today, we're incredibly blessed. We have a fascinating guest in Olga Deutsch. You'll have a chance to really learn from Olga, who personally, her background is in finance. Olga is part of a group known as NGO Monitor. NGO Monitor is very significant. It was started by Dr. Gerald Steinberg at Bar-Ilan University. And they're the ones who trace the money. They trace the links in terms of those various organizations that are front organizations for PFLP, front organizations for Hamas, the SJPs of the world. You know, who ultimately is running these things? Which nations are funding them? Which sources of revenue are funding these things? And we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, all directed towards hate, all directed in many cases, money that quote unquote is for humanitarian purposes, ends up arming the worst terrorists on earth. And it's a world that we are not familiar with. It's a world that we need to become familiar with and to understand. And there's no greater expert, and there's no more thoughtful person when it comes to this area than Olga Deutsch. And Olga, we can't thank you enough for taking the time to sharing with us, educating us. And we're really very excited, and we know this is critically important to learn from you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It is a pleasure and an honor. And thank you, FIDF, for doing an amazing job for amazing soldiers and all of their supporters around the world. It is really an honor.
Olga, please share with us. And what I would say is give us an education from 50,000 feet going all the way down to 5 feet.
Well, Stephen, if you allow me, I just want to pause for a second before we dive into the topic today, because we're filming this on a very particular day here in Israel. I'm talking to you from Tel Aviv in Israel, and this morning we all woke up to a reality of the funeral of Shiri and Ariel and Kfir Bibas. And as you can imagine, that is sort of the culmination in everything that is symbolic about the tragedy and the catastrophe that has befallen us on October the 7th and ever since. We all held our breaths short, hoping that a miracle might happen and that they might be alive. And last week, sadly, we all learned not only that they were murdered, but they were most brutally murdered, sort of epitomizing the brutality of Hamas and the enemy that we are looking at. And it is a very difficult day in Israel today that both marks symbolically the victory that our soldiers have been able to bring home, but also the pain that we all collectively as Israelis and as the Jewish people have been feeling since October the 7th. It is a national, it was really a difficult day. So I just wanted to mention that because it sort of, for everyone here in Israel, feels out of place to do anything else today other than to, bid them a final farewell. So thank you for allowing me to say that it's on such a special day. But it is not completely out of subject and out of topic for what we are about to discuss today. If before October the 7th, anyone would have asked me what is it that NGO Monitor does, I would have given a 5 minutes long answer, because for anyone not in the field of pro-Israel advocacy or fighting anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and BDS, it wouldn't necessarily immediately be clear. But after and ever since October the 7th, when I say that NGO Monitor's job is to defend Israel's right to exist within the human rights space, I think there's not a single person who this does not resonate with. And I'll explain why. We are a research-based organization that looks into the activities of so-called human rights and humanitarian non-governmental organizations, NGOs, that are involved within the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They come in different shapes and forms, ranging from the major, NGO superpowers, as Professor Steinberg, our president and founder, calls them, which is Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and Oxfam that everyone has heard of, and that we regularly read about their reports in the most sought after mainstream media, all the way to smaller Palestinian groups that very few people have heard of. But what is the common denominator between all of them is that instead of promoting human rights and humanitarian causes, they abuse their mandate in order to promote anti-Semitism, defame Israel, make it a pariah state, basically, portray everything and anything that Israel does as a violation of international law, and all the way to, claiming that Israel is an apartheid, or after October the 7th, a genocidal people, genocidal army, accusing Israelis army of, starving the Gazan people, and so on. Now, what is the funniest part? If it would just be an isolated phenomenon, that we would read about here and there in the media, that would be one thing. But what actually happens is that all these non-governmental organizations' reports are actually quoted as the most reliable and trusted sources that are quoted in the United Nations, in the Congress, in the bills tabled by the congressmen or parliaments around the world. And they are basically the ones driving the policies and the politics of what we refer to is the international community. Now, a lot has been said about the diversion of.
Olga,
Go ahead.
Just to repeat for us, you're referring to Amnesty International, you're referring to Human Rights Watch, and what was the third that you mentioned?
Oxfam, which is the biggest global Christian, aid organization. But those are the biggest ones that everyone has heard of. But you will have a smaller group, like Kurve Wustra, a German-based human rights organization that even in Germany, and trust me, I am very active in Germany, I'm fluent in German and have traveled to Germany a lot. Even in Germany, most of the people have never heard of this group. But what this group does is obsesses about Israel and the conflict, and partners and funnels governmental funds to anti-Israel groups. So we see them basically being the main force behind literally every tactics, every attempt to harm Israel. A lot has been said about the war, right? In Gaza, and not only Gaza. Like, we have been talking about multiple fronts that Israel had to fight since October the 7th. But the one front that, to my mind, not enough attention has been dedicated is actually the political front. And I'm going to say this on a briefing to FIDF with responsibility. The physical fronts are not to be belittled, right? And the price that we are paying and have been paying and probably will continue to pay is incredible and extremely painful. But having said that, I don't think that there is one person that believes that there is a day that we can wake up and that Israel is no longer there. We have a strong army and we have incredibly committed soldiers. And Israel's existence, physical existence, is a fact. And I am proud to have made Aliyah myself to Israel, wanting to raise my children as Israelis and not as Jews in diaspora. But the one front that has been a parallel one since October the 7th and even before is the political attack on Israel. And I'll elaborate. You will have a situation, and this is the simplest and the most straightforward one, where the Israeli hostages and the Israeli victims were not advocated for by the human rights organizations or by the UN, right, and different agencies, where the horrible sex assaults that are a fact that took place on October the 7th or afterwards against our hostages, the UN Women Organization, it took it months to even address it, let alone advocate for them. And most of the human rights organizations failed to say anything. You have Israelis making jokes right now about the Red Cross, that it is almost serving like an Uber service because it has completely failed to provide humanitarian services, right? To advocate for the hostages. But that is the most blatant and most obvious example of failing to, to recognize Israelis and Jews as potential victims. Then you have a situation where the hostages were held in UN and other humanitarian buildings and infrastructures and employees. But those are, again, the examples of how aid and humanitarian structures and infrastructure has been abused that are very straightforward and obvious. But then you'll have a situation in which, the International Criminal Court will issue arrest warrants against the head official, Israeli officials, and the International Court of Justice in The Hague will, during the claim by South Africa against Israel, accusing it of genocide, right, base their entire claims on NGO sources. Not only based it, but during the ICJ case against Israel in The Hague, it was Human Rights Watch and the biggest Palestinian so-called human rights organization, Al-Haq, that sat in the audience on the side of the South Africa. And in the claim, we found at least 26 footnotes leading to NGO sources. They are the ones that they resort to in trying to prove that Israel has been systematically violating human rights and international law. I'll take you further than that. We have been reading a lot in the last couple of months of continuous arrest warrants and calls for Interpol and local governments to arrest Israeli soldiers traveling the world, right? This is all led by a Belgium-based non-governmental organization that portrays itself, defines itself as a human rights organization. Even if you look at the businesses, one of the main ways to harm Israel, it has been trying to get as many investments divested from Israel or from companies doing business in Israel. The entire sphere of ESG has been dominated by Palestinian and other so-called human rights non-governmental organizations.
Can you define
sure.
for us ESG, that term?
Yes. It is basically a business term that stands for equality, sustainability, and governance. That is your 2.1 on corporate social responsibility. It is basically there to try to assure that our businesses are not only generating profit, but they're doing so in accordance to international law, human rights, gender equality, and so on and so on. So the pension funds and the investment funds use the services of so-called rating companies. These companies rate other companies' businesses and then provide them with a grade as to how profitable or lucrative a potential business is, and then investment funds and pension funds advise their clients whether they should invest their portfolios in that company or another company. Now, it will not come as a surprise to you after my introduction that one of the ratings that have been recently relatively added is the so-called human rights rating. And the ones that dictate what companies' ratings should be are actually human rights NGOs. It is not a professional service provided, rather non-governmental organizations. And then they will come and say that Caterpillar is a company that should not be invested in because they are providing bulldozers and trucks to IDF in order to displace illegal Bedouin settlements in the Negev, not even in what is referred to as, disputed territories. This is the level of how violent and how sophisticated attack is. So, we can be talking about, when we talk about BDS, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, we can be talking about, a random artist that will be, disinvited, or that will be bullied not to come to Israel, or an artist that should not present at a certain, gallery or cultural event. But a much more sophisticated thing is getting businesses behind the scenes to not invest in Israel or businesses that do business with Israel. And for anyone who has a business background like myself, that is the toughest one to estimate, meaning there is no way to really know how many investments never took place but could have taken place, right? So it is very difficult to even fathom the levels of the damage. I'm sure that everyone has heard of the United Nations Commission of Inquiry. That laid a legal precedent for the case at the International Criminal Court in The Hague against Israel. Because what happens is that International Criminal Court will say, well, according to the UN report, right? I don't know how many of you know that the creation of that committee was lobbied for by Human Rights Watch and Al-Haq, the biggest Palestinian so-called human rights NGO. Al-Haq is so ridiculous in its claims that it will say things and issue reports that claim things like the following one: that Israel was created. I'll raise you on that. The Zionist movement was created as a systematic attempt to steal Palestinian indigenous natural resources, meaning water, from the Palestinian people. And they will say that Israeli water company Mekorot is a proof of that. Now, to us, it might sound like a movie or a bad joke. But when these are cushioned in very sophisticated, legalistic sounding language and placed in an official submission to the United Nations, they are everything but a joke because they're being used as legal precedents to create a case against us. Now, especially after October the 7th, so much has been said about the diversion of aid, humanitarian and other aid. Most of the people will have you believe that all this aid is physically diverted, right? To build tunnels or rockets or to physically abuse the humanitarian infrastructure, like keeping hostages in hospitals or having Hamas, rockets or bases underneath UNRWA schools or hospitals. But that is only part of how the aid is diverted. A big portion of aid, and there's no way of knowing how much exactly, because one thing that is a very typical one for this is there is absolutely no transparency about anything that has to do with aid. And when I say aid, what you should hear about is actually your taxpayers' money that goes through governments to officially help people in third world countries and underdeveloped countries to develop democracy, sustainable development, human rights, and so on. But much of that aid to Palestinians has gone officially, and I quote, to political advocacy projects. In the last quarter of 2023, so mind you, that is exactly the 3 months after October the 7th, the UN requested $1.8 billion for the last quarter of 2023 in humanitarian aid for Gaza alone. When they presented to member states the three objectives that these funds would address, the third one was political advocacy. When we say political advocacy, you should hear anti-Israel political warfare, ICC, ICJ, abusing the business structures, right? Persecuting our soldiers around the world, sending biased reports to media, right, and fake or distorted truths, all the way to really mobilizing the streets of U.S. or any other country around the world, because Al-Haq, the Palestinian NGO I mentioned, right, as the biggest one and the most influential one, is a PFLP affiliated non-governmental organization. PFLP stands for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is one of the three Palestinian designated terror organizations by US, EU, Canada, and obviously Israel. But what is unique about PFLP is that they have a whole NGO network that is not only like other terror groups getting money from Qatar or any other hostile to Israel state, but is actually getting governmental, humanitarian, and development aid funds because they have built themselves as so-called human rights and humanitarian organizations and infiltrated themselves into the aid structures, meaning that not only do the governments fund them, but they actually resort to them as the trustworthy partners that are documenting the violation of human rights and international law on the ground. But in practice, we have a situation that instead of, a Palestinian human rights organization dealing with the rights of the Palestinian woman or the rights of a Palestinian child to have access to health services or any other human rights, it all boils down to attacking Israel and trying, it is really an orchestrated, systematic assault on truth and a political warfare with one goal, and that is to erode Israel's legitimacy and portray it as a pariah state and the biggest human rights violator. And there's nothing graver today in the discourse globally than to portray someone as a human rights violator. Steve, you were going to ask the question, right?
So you're saying American tax dollars are funding PFLP, a terrorist organization that is blacklisted by the United States, by the EU. Our tax dollars are funding the PFLP to delegitimize Israel to the tune of tens or hundreds of millions of dollars.
Not only PFLP, but Hamas, meaning we know, and by the way, NGO Monitor bases all its research on open source information. Open source, which is just a nice word, I always say this for Googling it. Obviously, it's more sophisticated than that. We have 18 staff members who do this day in, day out, but we screen information that is publicly available online. Why? Because we want to be able to sit in front of an elected official and say, if we can Google it, so can you. Meaning you don't need sophisticated forensic evidence or special AI managed and operated search engines to screen their social media accounts, right? Or their reports or their public statements. So there are two US-based humanitarian organizations, Mercy Corps and ANIRA, that have been for years now working with a Hamas-led Ministry of Social Development, and they have been distributing humanitarian aid as cash assistance to individuals and households based on the priority lists provided to them by a Hamas-led ministry. This is how bad it is.
Could you repeat those two NGOs that you're referring to?
Yes, it is Mercy Corps and ANIRA. These are two US-based organizations, and just to get your ear around it, Mercy Corps got $9 million from USAID in 2022. But since 2021, USAID earmarked $36.7 million US dollars for this organization alone. ANIRA got $12.5 million from USAID and another nearly $1 million from the State Department. So, bringing it closer to home, to the US discourse, and particularly now after the Trump administration came into office, and we've been witnessing all these executive orders, and very vivid discussions about USAID and what we should do. It is not so much about whether USAID should exist or not. It is almost the same like UNRWA. We all agree that UNRWA is horrible, and they have been complicit with Hamas and helping it, and not only to divert physical aid, but to actually create an environment, a culture in Gaza that in which children and the overall culture is a culture of hate towards Israel and the Jewish people. Because let's not forget, October the 7th did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in a cultural environment in which hating Jews and hating Israelis is the norm, right? And that was taught at UNRWA operated schools. But it is not enough to replace UNRWA or to cut funding to UNRWA. And it is not enough to halt funding to USAID. it's not even about cutting all funding. I wouldn't. It's not. Not only do I not think that U.S. as the greatest democracy today, or the European Union, right, should not be helping around the world. It should, but as a business, person of business background, I always like to compare everything to markets. You have a private market and you have the public sphere, and in both we are guided by same principles and values, which is transparency and accountability, right? We have our greatest leaders, both in the public sphere and in the business sphere, that can be literally taken down in a matter of minutes over one tweet. But when it comes to the civil society and the aid and the non-governmental organizations, and most certainly those that portray themselves as human rights, there's sort of a halo around them, and none of these values seem to apply, right? And it is the same thing. So what we are saying is that it is not enough to freeze funding to USAID and check it, but there should be vetting mechanisms, control mechanisms, and sanctions that should be defined in such a way that they should not only prevent diversion of taxpayers' dollars today, but in 10 years from now as well. And not only in the context of Gaza or the Palestinian conflict. And I'll explain why I say this, because we are all talking about, the UN flash appeal for Gaza and emergency humanitarian aid and aid for reconstructing Gaza and rebuilding Gaza after October the 7th. But it is not only for Gaza. The aid funneled through the governments and UN has exponentially grown both to Gaza and to what is referred to as West Bank, right? Since October the 7th. So we need to ask from our governments and elected officials to be critical about how this aid is provided, who it is provided for, and how we control and make sure that it does not go either to physically support terror, but in today's reality, the physical support to terror is not necessarily the most sophisticated or the most dangerous one, because that one, once tracked, is undisputed. But when it goes to political support terror, and that in practical terms for our discussion means to normalize and oftentimes even romanticize Hamas and other Palestinian organizations by, not calling them terrorists, but calling them freedom fighters, occupation fighters, or the recent article in New York Times from yesterday, right, where all of a sudden they're singling one Hamas guy who allegedly said that if he would have known that the consequences of October the 7th would have been this grave, he wouldn't have supported October the 7th in order to sort of whitewash Hamas as such, right? And ultimately to erode the legitimacy of anything that Israel does. Now, it does not only weaken what Israel can do, it does not only make IDF worry not only about how it is waging a war physically, but how it rates in media and how it is seen and portrayed and discussed. And, IDF soldiers are probably the only ones that have to run their operations under a magnifying glass, right, of the public eye. But it is a much broader issue where the entire Jewish community around the world is terrorized by it. I always say when I talk to elected officials around the world, you should not sanction these organizations and you should not regulate the space concerning aid for the sake of us in Israel. You should do it for your own sake, because it is the streets of London and Berlin and Washington and Seattle that are being mobilized. And we have seen that both on the streets of US, but also on campuses, right? Last year.
A few examples of how these NGOs work, whether it's funding SJP, whether it's funding riots in the streets, on campuses, be it here or in Europe?
Well, they would want you to believe that it is a collection of, or expression of organic mobilization of frustrated citizens, right? And human rights fighters. But we are talking about a network of well-connected organizations. We ran a project last year where we just tried to physically map the organizations behind the US, and then we had a parallel project in Canada, campus violence. In the US, we mapped 157 so-called non-governmental organizations. And more interestingly, we mapped over 3,000 connections between them. Now, it was not that difficult to cluster them into categories. Some of them were lobby groups operating in Congress and other parliaments. Some of them were research groups, basically issuing reports based on which, right, other groups could say Israel is a systematic violator of human rights. Israel just violated the international law, making a legal case against Israel. Some of them were lawfare groups. Now, lawfare is a term, created by Alan Dershowitz that basically says it is an abuse of legal systems to harm Israel. So, filing lawsuits just like those against Israeli soldiers, but not only, right? And then some of them were what we call funders. When we analyzed the 157 groups, most of them led to the 4 or 5 same fiscal sponsors, right? Now, what is interesting in fighting these groups is that in very few places around the world, governments know that they're not alone in addressing this issue. Take Samidun. I'm sure everyone listening to me now has at least heard about this group after October the 7th and after the campus violence in US and Canada, because they were one of the main groups behind the violence and mobilizing the crowds. Now, they are a PFLP affiliated organization. Interestingly enough, they were banned, they were outlawed in Germany 1 week after October the 7th. But even in Germany, when I briefed German elected officials way before October the 7th about Samidun's global network, they were shocked. They thought that they were only active in Germany. So did the Dutch and so did the Americans, right? But what they didn't know is that it started in Europe. By the way, most of these phenomena started in Europe, whether it's an academic boycott or BDS or even abusing the ESG structures, right? It started in Europe, and then once it hits the North American shores, it becomes even bigger. But one thing that most certainly happens, it becomes more easier to track in the public sphere because the American society tends to be just that much more demanding when it comes to transparency, right, in the public sphere. But the Khaled Barakat, who was the head of Samidun, was actually denied visa in Germany for his PFLP terror-affiliated activities. Then he moved to Canada, where his partner, Charlotte Keats, is a resident, right? And she's one of the main figures. By the way, last week starred in Lebanon. She a regular in Tehran, right? And she attended Nasrallah's funeral last week with Samidun's flags. But when he tried to enter EU through the Netherlands, then the Dutch banned him from entering. But it is only when the campus violence erupted that there was enough interest for all these different pieces to come together. Because we have been, for example, as NGO Monitor, we have been pointing to all these issues for years now. But unfortunately, before October the 7th, most of the public, and this is both the Jewish community and the elected officials and governments around the world, did not deem anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism as a really as an existential threat. And I cannot stress this enough. It is an additional front for Israel, and that is the one that we have to fight with all our might. Because as I said before, physically, no one's gonna harm Israel. There's no fear whether Israel is going to be around. We have a strong army. But politically, in the community of the international democratic states, to be portrayed or attacked as a pariah state, as a human rights violator, as an apartheid state, as a genocidal people, there is nothing worse than that. And then they're pushing us to fight them on these fronts rather than focus on what is a really existential front for us. And they're also terrorizing the global Jewish community, as we have seen since October the 7th. So, to sum it up for you, it is not about any one of these NGOs, because they're just fronts for what is a global campaign, right? And they all work together and they're all feeding into each other. And sadly, a lot of them are funded through our taxpayers' money. Not knowingly always, although sometimes yes. And in the case of the European governments, for years they have not only funded but supported and given platform to the PFLP NGO network. When I say platform, I always tell them giving an organization funding is one thing, but giving them a stage at a European Parliament or quoting them in an official UN document, or for this organization to be able to put an EU or German federal government's or USAID's emblem on their report gives them a layer of legitimacy that no money can buy, and it basically whitewashes what is a very violent, radical, Israel canceling politics that has been applying a very aggressive lobby against us for years. But since October the 7th, the gloves are off. So we cannot be idle, and we have to fight them with all that we've got.
Your website, could you share that with us?
Sure. So, at the risk of sounding funny, we're not a sexy pro-Israel organization. Our website is basically a database of a few hundred NGOs, and we update our info files, as we call them, on each of these groups on regular basis. We screen the online space. Everything is publicly available, and we basically document what we call are the distortions of their proclaimed agenda, which is to promote human rights and humanitarian causes, and how they basically abuse their mandates to harm Israel or promote anti-Semitism, or yes, support terror. So for anyone who would like to have more information without commentary, because we don't give political, interpretation to this, we just present information. For anyone to use, they can use our website as a database. But we do more than that. We work with literally every group around the world, every Jewish group or non-Jewish that does pro-Israel work, and we customize it and tailor this. We work with governments. We strive to be a resource, right, for them in a global call that governments should make sure that taxpayers' dollars or euros, aid money, reaches those who really need it and is not abused to go to those who not only harm Israel. This is not an Israel-focused issue, right? They go to work against U.S. interests. One of the biggest grantees of the U.S. government is a Norwegian organization. It's called the Norwegian Refugee Council, one of the biggest humanitarian organizations around the world. For years, they have been lobbying U.S. Congress and USAID to relax anti-terror vetting mechanisms. I mean, you would think that that's insane, right? But they will tell you that the humanitarian principle trumps all, and that humanitarian aid should be provided at any cost, even if some of it goes to physically or otherwise support terror. But in today's reality, we understand way too well that is a very dangerous thing. They were the ones, with others who lobbied U.S. government to cancel U.S. designation of Houthis as a terror organization. And we all know what happened with Houthis since October the 7th and with the attacks from Yemen. So it is not an issue to underestimate. There's a lot of money at stake. The request of the United Nations for Gaza for 2025 is $4 billion US dollars. That is just through the UN. Every member state also provides aid directly. So we're talking about an enormous amount of money. Now, you could say cut all aid, or you could say differently. You could say there's a different reality that international community could bring about. How about imagine a world in which the international community took charge and accountability for the aid and used it as an agent of long-term process of de-radicalization of the Palestinian society, where let's say in 30 years from now, the biggest ideal of an average Gazan kid was not to hijack an Israeli soldier. And even before October the 7th, some of these governmental aid monies went to support projects like a Gaza-based kindergarten, where during the final,
Final
theater
exam?
show, no, final theater show in a kindergarten, um, where my kid was playing Sun or whatever, singing and dancing, and your kid as well, probably. The Gazan kids had a mock trial, like mock show on stage where half of the class played IDF soldiers and half of the class played Hamas soldiers who abducted them. This is way before October the 7th. None of this is new. It is magnified and it has exploded to our faces after October the 7th. But we need to use the momentum. I know it sounds bad, but we need to leverage the historic opportunity that we have now, both in terms of how horrific the um, uh, the horrors of the war and of October the 7th have been, because it is still in the public sphere, right? And people still understand why we opened the war against Hamas, but also of the US administration right now willing to critically look into these issues, to work with them and say, let's not just cut funds. Let's not just resort to big statements, but let us revise it and make sure that for decades to come, the vetting mechanisms, the control mechanisms, and the sanctions in place are such that can secure that none of the taxpayers' money goes to terror, one way or the other.
Olga, thank you really for enlightening us, for educating us. As you said, you've got an NGO war going on right now in Europe, in America, across the globe, and it's taxpayers' dollars of democratic nations that are funding the hate, the delegitimization of Israel, and the attack on Jews, on Zionists, and on just basic Jewish Christian values. And we can't thank you enough for educating us, for sharing with us. And your organization, NGO Monitor, has the most incredible respect from those in government, the most incredible respect from those who are in the judiciary, as well as those who stand for any sense of morality and any sense of ethics. They know it's NGO Monitor that presents the facts clearly, doesn't editorialize, and ultimately enables them to try to stop this kind of corruption, this war, this vicious lawfare, this vicious delegitimization that's being funded to the tunes of hundreds of millions of dollars. And we can't thank you enough.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.